So one of the plants that's kind of interesting if you have a poorly drained site that might have a lot of clay soil where the water runs down and kind of sits. We're down actually in one of our sinkholes here on the grounds of Springhouse Gardens. But if you're interested in native plants that have some early spring interest, that also would be good for cutting and for some decorating inside. This is actually a type of willow, and you might be able to see it here. This is actually a pussy willow. It's got the really soft catkins that are just budding out and blooming out very, very nicely right now. These are just the buds. If you don't cut these off right now, they're going to turn into flowers, and then the flowers fall off. They attract all kinds of pollinators. But if you want these for decorating, you need to cut them while they're at this stage, and don't put them in water, because this will dry them just like this, and they'll stay for years in this fuzzy state like this. But this is a type of willow called Salix discolor, but the common name is a pussy willow. So great small tree for wet areas, clay areas, and it will grow eventually to 15 to 20 feet tall. Ours don't get that big because I keep cutting them back every year. I'll cut these back to remove these big long stems, and these are what you can use for decorating. But if you don't cut it every year, it's going to grow up about 15 to 20 feet. Not a terribly long-lived tree. It might last for 15 or 20 years. But the fun thing about these is if you don't care about preserving the catkins, if you put them in water, they'll root, and you can plant the little seedlings, and they'll grow into a tree pretty quickly. The other way, a lot of times if you make a new cut, stick it down in the ground, they'll root in the ground as well. So it's one that's very, very easy to propagate and get more trees. Okay, so there's not a lot of evergreens that will tolerate clay and damp and maybe even wet soils, but there's a family of evergreens that you should try, and we've got 4 different ones down in here by our tobacco barn, where we've got a whole series of rain gardens. Basically, a rain garden is a depressed area that allows all the water to kind of run into it, and it sits for a little bit. They're designed to just hold the water, but they still should drain within a 24 to 48 hour time period. You don't want them to hold water. It's not a water garden, it's a rain garden. It's just to slow that water down. And these arborvitaes are a great evergreen to utilize some of that water that's readily available after a rain. So this particular one is called a fire chief arborvitae, and it has 2 different kinds of foliage. There's a really very, the immature foliage looks completely different than the mature foliage. So it kind of changes as the plant gets older. When you buy them in the garden shop, they look completely different than this. And they seem like they're going to stay small, but we like to show this. This is one plant. And if you read the tag on your plant, it's going to say, oh, it stays 2 to 3 feet high by 2 to 3 foot wide. This guy's at least 7 feet wide, and he's at least 3 foot tall right now. So you can't believe every tag that you see. But this is a fire chief arborvitae. Some of the other ones that you might see down here in our display area are a green giant arborvitae, a Hetz midget arborvitae. So it's kind of fun. We have a giant and a midget, and then there's one called Sherwood frost. But any of those arborvitae plants are going to do well in a damp clay soil. Well, continuing on the plants that like poorly drained soils and can take clay soils, this is called sweet flag. The Latin name is Acorus, that's A-C-O-R-U-S, and this is a variegated form. There's 2 that we sell a lot of. One's called Ogon, and one's called Aborazuki. I can't remember which one this one is. It's one of those 2. But this is what they look like after a fairly good cold winter. I'm getting ready to clean these up. So normally, like any ornamental grass, you just have to cut off the tips so that you get that kind of brown stuff off of there. But this is a great plant for poorly drained areas. So this is one of our many rain gardens. All of the water, when we have a rain event, comes down and kind of settles in this garden here. And this guy loves lots of water. It can actually grow in standing water, but it doesn't need standing water to do well. It just needs moisture. And this one is disguising one of our drainage pipes. So when this one fills up, it goes into a pipe that's right behind here, flows into another one of our rain gardens, and so on until it gets to the big sinkhole that we have, and then it goes on to the Kentucky River. But this is a great plant if you're looking for something that's mostly evergreen and with very little maintenance. About the only thing you have to do to it is clean it up a little bit here in March and April before the new growth starts. So this little gem is called Sedum Angelina. And most of your sedums are not evergreen. Most of them, as soon as we have a frost, just kind of melt away until the next spring. But this one stays evergreen. And typically during the growing season, it's this real bright chartreusey color. You might see it back here a little bit. And in the wintertime, it takes on oranges and reds like these guys are here. Pretty soon, as it warms up, all of these oranges and reds will just go to this bright golden look here. So it's a fantastic plant for sunny, dry, well-drained areas. A lot of people might know sedums that have flowers that are very showy. They're also called stone crops or live forever. So it's S-E-D-U-M. There's tons of different types of sedums or stone crops. This particular one, these are the old flowers from last year. They're not particularly showy, so I typically, even when it's blooming, I'll cut these flowers off because I think it detracts from the overall look and neatness of this plant. And these don't look particularly well right at the moment here in March because there's a lot of leaves and things on them, but it forms a fantastic ground cover. And the nice thing about it is any of these little things that you pick off, or if you want to get more of these, you can just break these off and set them on the ground and they will root. So this is probably 100 plants here because they're just little bits and pieces that have fallen on the ground. So once you get them started, you'll probably never have to buy another one again. But it's just a fantastic evergreen perennial. Well, one of the neat things about Springhouse Gardens is that you can walk around the grounds and the gardens and see plants where they're happy. This was kind of a surprise. I planted something that looked like this. This is firewitch. This is probably my favorite of the dianthus. This whole family is called dianthus or cheddar pinks. And they start out about that size. You can sometimes find them bigger than this, but this is a good starter size. And I planted, I think there was 5 of these that I planted back about there, maybe 10 years ago. Plants will decide where they want to grow. There used to be, well actually there still is, a big bare rock here. But this plant started there and it just is growing and covering the rock. Look at, this is one plant and it's just grown over top of the rock. So it does make it harder for me to walk on those rocks, but that plant is growing where it wants to grow. I've got a lot of clay back in here, and sometimes if it's too heavy clay, a dianthus is going to rot, especially in the wintertime. So these really need well-drained soil. But if you have big rocks and gravelly areas, even if you've got a clay-based soil, as long as the plant can kind of grow up where it stays drier, it can grow in clay. It just has to have create it's a place where it's perfectly happy. So this is a good example of planting back here, and then the plant covers the rock. So this will have beautiful, very fragrant, bright pink flowers growing up about this high in about a month. I don't even see the flower buds yet. The only maintenance that you have to do on this is to cut those spent flower heads off, and then you'll have this beautiful evergreen foliage the rest of the year. Well, we're in what we call the hillside shade garden, which is the area immediately behind our business office or the cottage. And one of the plants that I found that has done very, very well here is called a Lenten rose, or Helleborus. The other common name is hellebore, which doesn't sound very common, but these are plants that are very, very well suited for central Kentucky, mainly because they require an alkaline-based soil. Now, this does need a well-drained alkaline soil. So in an area like this where we've got a lot of trees, good drainage because we're on a slope, these Lenten roses have just thrived. And they're a very early blooming perennial plant, so they are going to come back every year. These have been growing and naturalizing here on our hillside for the past 20 years. So I've got a lot of them. And they do spread quite nicely. Sometimes people don't want them to spread this much, but for me, it's a wonderful plant that is always a nice blooming plant in March and April and well into May. They're called Lenten roses because they typically bloom during the season of Lent. So they come in all different colors: pinks, reds, purples, greens, even black, and white, of course. But one of the things that you do need to know about them is that all of the parts of the plant are poisonous. So that's one thing, but that also keeps rabbits and deer from eating them. They are a very, very, it's a great plant for early pollinators, so the honeybees love these. So even though they're poisonous, the bees and all kinds of pollinators will use these for that early pollen needs. But one of the other things that you have to do, this is the foliage from last year. And even though we call it an evergreen perennial, this foliage needs to be removed prior to the new foliage coming up. So the flowers come up first and then the leaves will appear. So I just have to go through every spring, and a lot of times I'll wait for the flowers and I'll cut these old leaves off, and basically all the old leaves will be around the outside of the plant, pretty much on the ground. So you can just kind of go around and remove that. And it's as simple as that. You just remove that old foliage, get that all out of there, and then the new growth will have more room to grow, and the flowers will appear prettier too. So, you know, I've already cleaned this one up, and this one I just need to get out and do a little garden work. If you don't want them to spread, you would just remove these flower heads before the seeds mature, which will be in about a month to a month and a half. For me, I just let them all go to seed, and that's how I get all these slightly different varieties, because these are going to get cross-pollinated with all of the different Lenten roses, and I'll have new varieties that will pop up here in different places. So for me, I kind of like all the little babies coming up, but some people might want to curtail that a little bit. But Lenten roses, Helleborus, you should try them in your garden. If you're looking for a shrub for mostly shade to maybe a little bit of sun, let me recommend one of the many oak leaf hydrangeas. Oak leaf hydrangeas are actually native to the southeastern United States, and there's lots of different varieties of oak leaves. Right here by our cottage, we have 4 different ones that you might be able to see at different times of the year. And right now it's a little early to really see their true beauty, but there are things to look at all 4 seasons. This is a leaf that's left over. A lot of times an oak leaf hydrangea won't drop all of their leaves, which is kind of interesting. But look at the shape of that leaf. It's like an oak leaf. That's where they get their name. But they do have beautiful summer blooms on them, and right now I'm kind of cleaning some of those old blooms off. But most of the oak leaves will start blooming in late May through the month of June and a little bit into July. So it's kind of an early summer bloomer. And they're mostly white flowers, but this is one of the newer varieties called Ruby Slippers. And this one starts with a white flower that gets a really nice pink highlight to it. And it'll be more pink with more sun. The thing about the oak leaves is that If they're in more sun, they'll need more rainfall or more watering because they really do like a moist soil. But ruby slippers will top out at about 5 to maybe 6 foot tall. Whereas there's one called peewee that stays about, maybe 3 foot high. There's one even smaller called munchkin that won't get any bigger than 2 foot. And then there's one called Alice that gets 10 feet tall. So you need to know which oak leaf hydrangea you're looking for and which one you should buy depending on how much space you have. One of my other favorites is called Snowflake, and it has flowers that grow about this large, and they're double flowers. So Snowflake might be one that you like, and that one stays in that medium range, maybe 5 to 6 foot tall. But look for oak leaf hydrangeas if you want something native, more natural looking, with beautiful flowers for a more shaded location. Well, I wanted to show you our pawpaw patch. This is something that when we bought our farm 26 years ago, there were no pawpaws on this property. But pawpaws are great Kentucky native, and I always wanted to have a pawpaw patch. And I tried digging up little starts from people that had pawpaws growing. They're almost impossible to dig up from a root sprout. So if you want a pawpaw patch, you'll need to start with a containerized tree. And that's why we sell lots and lots of pawpaws here. So as long as they're started and they're in a pot, you're going to have great success with them. So we started with just 3 containerized trees here about, maybe 15 years ago. They're not extremely fast growers, especially when you plant them in a really shaded environment. But what they do is that they multiply. So these are all each little sprouts that have come up from the 3 trees that we planted. And one poor pawpaw got crushed by a big tree that fell. So it's trying to come back up, but like many trees, when you remove the main trunk, the roots sprout up. So I think a lot of these have sprouted up from where this tree had the damage. But these are all young little pawpaws. We do get a nice crop of pawpaws even in the full shade, but this tree will fruit much better if you plant it in the full sun, and it will look completely different in the full sun than it does in the full shade. Here with this much shade, the leaves are almost out horizontally, but in the full sun, the leaves bend downwards and it looks like a haunted tree. It looks very kind of spooky. So it looks very, very different whether you're planting in the sun or the shade, and it's just the pawpaw's natural defense mechanism. If it's in the full sun, the leaves would get sunburned, so they kind of bend them down this way and it keeps them from getting sunburned, but they fruit much better that way. Another tip about pawpaws is that you need 2 different varieties or plants from 2 different sources for them to really fruit well. That means that if you've got a friend that's growing them from the same tree, you really want to get from different areas so that you get better cross-pollination and better fruit set. So we've been planting them from a lot of different sources, so we get good cross-pollination and we'll get lots of nice pawpaws. We very rarely get to eat them because the possums, the skunks, the raccoons, I think it's the raccoons that come in here, and they literally climb the trees, and you can see all the broken branches with them trying to climb to get them. So I have to do a lot of pruning on my pawpaws until they'll get bigger because the raccoons really go after the fruit, and most of the time they go before the fruit's even ripe. So we very rarely get to eat that really delicious, very interesting, custardy, banana looking and smelling fruit. So if you've never had a pawpaw, you need to try one and then try to plant one and grow one.